been a ghost in this town, a man hardened by loss and work, keeping his distance from anything that might stir the old wounds in his heart. His life had become nothing more than the rhythm of dawn to dusk labor, the scraping of hooves against dirt, and the silent passage of days that blurred into one another. There was no room for distraction. He had no room for the kinds of emotions that had once burned so brightly in his chest. Those had been buried long ago, hidden under the weight of pain. A love lost and never to return. Then came Clara Mae. She appeared one afternoon, as unexpected as a thunderstorm in a drought, and with her came a glimmer of something Jack hadn't felt in years. She wasn't much to look at least not at first glance. Her clothes were plain, dusted from travel, and there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of hardship, of a life lived without the luxury of ease. But it was the child she carried in her arms that caught Jack's attention. A baby, barely 6 months old, with large eyes that seemed to see the world with a kind of quiet understanding that made Jack pause. As Clara stepped up onto the porch, holding her baby close, Jack couldn't help but notice the way the child's gaze locked onto his, unblinking, as if the baby knew something Jack had long forgotten. Mr. Turner," she said, her voice soft, but steady. "I hear you're looking for someone to cook and clean." Her words, though simple, carried a weight of vulnerability, of desperation for something she couldn't quite put into words. Her life had taken a turn she hadn't planned for, and now she was here, on this rugged land, looking for a place to start over. Jack didn't speak at first, his eyes still fixed on the baby's gaze, as if the child's innocent stare was some kind of unspoken challenge. But he eventually nodded, stepping aside and muttering a quiet invitation. "Come on in," he said, his voice low, rough from years of silence. "I could use the help." As Clara crossed the threshold, Jack noticed the way she moved, graceful despite the burden she carried. There was something about her, something that made Jack's heart ache in a way he wasn't ready to acknowledge. It wasn't just the way she held herself, or the way she tended to the baby with such tender care. It was the way her presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in the house, the way the air shifted when she entered. Jack wasn't used to feeling like this, not since the days when he had a family of his own. Those days felt like another lifetime now one he had left behind when his wife had passed, taking his dreams of love and happiness with her. But here, in the presence of a woman he didn't know, and a baby who seemed to see right through him, Jack felt the faintest stirrings of something he thought he had buried forever. Hope. As the days passed, Clara settled into a quiet rhythm at the ranch. She cooked the meals, cleaned the house, and tended to the small garden Jack had managed to keep alive, though it wasn't much more than a patch of stubborn green among the dry earth. Her baby, Ely, spent most of his days in her arms or in the wooden crib Jack had found for him in the barn. Jack had never been much of a talker, but Clara's calm presence made the silence between them feel less heavy, less oppressive. In the evenings, after a long day's work, they'd share a simple meal, beans cornbread. Whatever Clara could make out of what little they had, Jack would listen as she spoke, her voice soft but steady, telling him about her life before. Red Valley, her story wasn't much different from Jack's. A life built on dreams that had been shattered by the hands of fate. She spoke of her late husband, a kind man who had died young, leaving her with nothing but the baby in her arms, and a few meager possessions. He worked hard, she'd say, looking down at Eli with a softness in her eyes. But it wasn't enough to keep him here. She never asked for pity, never complained. Clara was the kind of woman who carried her grief silently, like a weight she had long since learned to bear. Yet, there was a quiet strength in her that Jack couldn't ignore. It wasn't the strength that came from surviving hardship, but the kind that came from living with it, day after day, and still finding a way to keep going. And it wasn't just her words that made Jack feel something stir inside him. It was the way Eli would look at him, those large, innocent eyes following his every move with a quiet curiosity. The baby didn't seem to fear him, didn't shy away from his rough exterior or the scars of his past. Instead, Eli would smile at him with the pure, unguarded joy that only a child could express, and Jack would feel a strange warmth in his chest. He didn't understand it at first. Why would a man like him, a man who had long ago given up on anything resembling affection, feel this pull toward a widow and her child? At night, when Clara would put Eli to bed, Jack would find himself sitting on the porch, looking out at the darkened landscape. The stars seemed sharper here, brighter than he ever remembered, but they did little to quiet the restless thoughts. In his mind, he'd lost everything once, and now, with Clara and Eli in his life, he could feel that old ache returning, the kind of ache that had driven him to shut himself off from everyone and everything. It was a feeling he'd buried deep, thinking it was gone, but here it was again, knocking at the door of his heart. For the first time in years, Jack found himself wondering if he was ready to open that door. The weeks rolled on, and with each passing day, the connection between Clara, Eli, and Jack deepened in ways Jack hadn't expected. It was subtle. At first, like the slow unfurling of a flower, but it was there. Jack began to notice how Clara's presence seemed to anchor him. Her laughter, though quiet, filled the house in a way that made everything feel warmer, lighter. She never asked for much, just a roof over her head, a safe place for her son, but there was an undeniable strength in her that made Jack feel like maybe he wasn't as alone in the world as he had always believed. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the evenings they spent together, sitting on the porch or by the fire, talking about anything and everything, and sometimes nothing at all. There was no rush, no urgency. Clara was content with the quiet moments, and Jack began to realize that, perhaps, so was he. Clara, for her part, had started to notice the changes in Jack. At first, she'd kept her distance, unsure whether the brooding, solitary man would ever open up to her. But over time, she came to understand the way he worked. Jack didn't speak much, but his actions were louder than words. She saw how he cared for Eli, how his rough hands would gently hold the baby when he had the chance. She noticed how, when Eli's tiny hand would reach for him, Jack would hesitate, as though unsure how to handle the affection, but then gently take the baby in his arms. His rough demeanor softening just enough to reveal the tenderness he had buried for so long. One evening after a long day of work, Jack sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across his face. Clara, who had been tending to Eli in the small back room, stepped outside to join him. She held the baby close, the weight of him familiar and comforting in her arms, but her eyes were drawn to Jack as she sat down beside him. There was a stillness between them now, a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken. Clara could see it in Jack's eyes, the way they softened when they landed on Eli, the way he would look away quickly as if the emotions were too much for him to bear. But Clara had been watching him, and she knew. She could feel it too, this bond that was growing between them. Jack, Clara said, her voice tentative, as if testing the waters. You've never told me about your wife. The question hung in the air, and Jack stiffened, his gaze flickering toward the fire. For a moment he didn't speak, the weight of the past pressing down on him like a storm cloud. But Clara's gentle presence gave him the strength to speak, to finally confront the memories he had spent years avoiding. Her name was Sarah, he said quietly, his voice rough with the years of unshed grief. She died a long time ago. Before Eli was born. I couldn't save her. I couldn't save her from the illness that took her. Didn't say anything, but she could see the pain in his eyes, the raw ache that he had never truly allowed anyone to see. She placed a hand gently on his arm, a silent gesture of understanding, and for the first time, Jack didn't pull away. He let her touch him, let her see the man behind the walls he had built so high. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a quiet kind of understanding, a space where the past could linger, but where the future still held. The promise of something more. Jack looked at Clara, his eyes meeting hers for the first time without the usual guardedness. There was something about the way she had been patient with him, about the way she hadn't pushed him, that made him want to open up, to let her see the parts of him he had kept hidden for so long. And as he gazed at Eli, sleeping peacefully in her arms, Jack felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't realized was missing until now. He wasn't sure what it meant, or what it would lead to, but in that moment, he knew that this quiet, simple life they were building together was something he had longed for. Whether he knew it or not, as the fire crackled softly between them, Jack finally allowed himself to feel it hope. Not the kind that had burned brightly in his younger years, but a quieter, steadier kind that had a way of creeping up on a man when he least expected it. And for the first time in a long while, Jack Turner didn't feel so alone. Winter came harder than expected, its chill settling deep into the bones of Red Valley. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn and the ranch house, and the land, once so dry and unforgiving, now seemed like a place lost in time, stuck between the grip of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But inside the house, there was warmth, real warmth fueled not just by the fire that crackled in the hearth, but by the unspoken bond that had grown between Clara, Jack, and Eli. The days were shorter, the nights colder, but the small family they had become found comfort in each other's company. Jack no longer spent his evenings alone on the porch, staring at the dark horizon. Instead, he spent them with Clara, sometimes talking about nothing at all, and other times sharing pieces of their pasts, piecing together a story that was somehow still unwritten. It was a kind of quiet contentment, a slow, steady growth that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. One evening, after a particularly hard day of work, Clara stepped outside into the cold to find Jack standing by the barn, staring out at the snow-covered hills. Eli was sleeping soundly inside, and the warmth of the house seemed to pull Clara in, but she found herself drawn to Jack, as she often was these days. He had changed, she could see that. There was a softness in the way he looked at her, and when his eyes met hers now, they didn't turn away. Instead, they lingered, acknowledging something neither of them had ever voiced aloud. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Clara found herself standing beside him in silence, their breath mingling in the cold air, neither of them needing to speak. I've been thinking, Jack said after a long pause, his voice low, as though the words had been weighing on him for a while. About what's next. About what this ... is. Clara turned toward him, her heart quickening in her chest. She had been thinking the same thing, wondering where this path was leading them. She had never expected to feel this way, not after everything she had been through, and certainly not after losing her husband. But with Jack, something had shifted. Something had begun to grow, quietly, like a seed planted in the cold earth that was now starting to sprout. What do you mean? She asked, her voice gentle but steady. Jack looked down at the ground for a moment, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The winter wind swept around them, but it didn't seem to touch them in the same way it once did. The distance between them had closed, and for the first time, Jack wasn't sure where his heart stood. He had been running from love for so long, afraid to open himself to the possibility of loss again. But now, looking at Clara, at the way she held herself and her son with such quiet strength, Jack couldn't deny the truth that had been gnawing at him for weeks. He wanted this. He wanted this life they were building together. I think I want you here, Jack said finally, his voice rough, almost as if the words were foreign to him. For as long as you need. For as long as we need. I didn't think I'd feel this way, Clara, but I do. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she heard him speak the words she had longed to hear, though she hadn't dared to dream they would come from him. The vulnerability in his voice made her chest tighten. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was everything she had hoped for. Jack wasn't asking her to stay forever, he wasn't making promises of forever. But he was offering her a place in his life, a place in his heart, something he hadn't done for anyone in a long time. And somehow, in that quiet, snow-covered moment, Clara knew that they had both found something they hadn't expected to find. A second chance. A chance at love, at family, at building something that would endure beyond the hardships of the past. Her heart swelled as she looked at him, and for the first time since her husband's death, Clara allowed herself to hope again. She didn't know what the future held for them, but in that moment, with Jack by her side and Eli sleeping soundly inside, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The walls she had built around herself, the ones she thought would protect her from the pain of the past, began to crumble, replaced by something far stronger. Trust in Jack, in the life they had started together, and in the quiet love that had slowly taken root in her heart. I'm not going anywhere, Clara whispered, her voice steady and filled with a warmth that reached Jack's very core. Not unless you want me to. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply took a step closer to her, his hand brushing against hers in the cold night air. And for the first time in years, Jack Turner didn't feel the weight of his past pushing him down. He felt free to love again, free to hope, and free to share a life with the woman and child who had unknowingly filled the emptiness he had lived with for so long. The storm of the past had passed, and a new kind of calm had settled over Red Valley, one that promised the warmth of a future built on the kind of love that could endure, no matter the hardships that lay ahead.